Today is the second day of the June-July 1985 7-day retreat. We will start by talking about something someone brought up in a meeting. Want to say at the outset of bringing things up that have been brought up in a meeting that I do not remember verbatim what somebody says, and for this purpose here it is not important. The question is rephrased, hoping that it will be of interest and concern, and maybe answer some questions that other people have not had a chance to bring up. What was said is, what am I to do with what is said in a talk such as yesterday, where it is pointed out how we trap ourselves, how we deceive ourselves. This whole problem of self-image and so forth. Am I to keep thinking about that? If I do that, I find I get caught up in conceptualization. And it leads nowhere. It does not solve the problem. Or am I to just drop all these thoughts, cut them off, not think them at all? There are no instructions given here on how to proceed with anything that is said. During this hour or whatever length of time we're talking together, looking at things together and thinking together, can it really happen together? That as words are said and something is put into words, expressed in words, very inadequately at times, that one listens and looks at the same time. Maybe something will become clear. Something will be seen within oneself through this process of looking and thinking together. It does not mean to take what is being said, commit it to memory, and then go over it. Keep on thinking on one's own. If it happens, how is one there? Are the thoughts just automatically going? Or is one actively thinking something through for oneself because there's a need to do so? And then is one looking at the same time? Or is just a narrow track of conceptual, intellectual thinking? Or does one also pause to look what happens in oneself or what has happened, evoking a clear memory of something that took place in the past, to try to sort it out and see and look through it once more. If there's this need to do it, to bring order into something that was not closed, finished and done with. Or one may not continue thinking about what was talked about at all, and something may suddenly strike one. One sees a self-image directly. Then there's no problem. If it is really seen, does it have to continue? If one sees that it is immediately a screen, an enclosure, the question of whether to cut off the thoughts, to prevent oneself from thinking these thoughts. How does one do it in the first place? One has to have very rigorous techniques to control thought, to cut off thought. Usually a concentrative exercise, concentrating on a question or concentrating on the breathing so as not to allow thought to arise, but the system breaks down all the time. Or else one becomes so skilled at it that thoughts are, for the duration of the exercise, in abeyance, by force, by the force of concentration on the exercise. But the problem, the fundamental problem, is not resolved of why thoughts arise in the first place, what they circulate around, what they're trying to do, how one gets lost in them, why. It's something to be seen in awareness. Which brings up this whole question of what is awareness. What is right seeing? I've used recently in a talk an example of limited awareness. I'll use it once more because it is very illustrative of limited awareness that we're practicing so often. Practicing in quotation marks. One has heard so much about doing everything very attentively, and there can come a real mode of being attentive. One can train oneself in attentiveness. What happened was one person putting on, it was during the last retreat, putting on a jacket before a sitting, standing up in one of the aisles, and it was so clear that there was great care and attention in the way in which the jacket was put on. It was done slowly, not absent-mindedly. Attention was given to detail, the button slipping through the buttonhole. And while this was going on, another person was standing behind this person who was putting on the jacket, trying to get by in the aisle. The aisle was slit and was narrow. But the person who was putting the jacket on was not aware of someone standing behind. The person waited for a while and then tried to walk around this outstretched arm had to walk over cushions, and finally managed to get by and walk to the seat. And the person, the jacket attentive person, was not aware of that. Never seemed to notice that. That's how we are. We may be so minutely attentive, and with that minute, careful attention, if one watches really carefully, not just the jacket and the buttonhole and the button, but this image, hey, I'm really attentive right now. That is really the narrowing factor, the most narrowing factor. Having someplace an image in there of oneself, of doing really well. I'm not saying that was the case there, but one can observe it in oneself. This is not what we're talking about. We're talking about awareness, this concentrating on a particular task. Out of a training, out of the idea that it is good to be attentive, it's good for the body, it's good for the mind. That's narrow. The very idea narrows the mind. It's not open, receptive, sensitive to everybody else around in this world. And the wind in the trees. The birds. So in becoming aware that one was lost in conceptualization about something, interpreting something, or just thinking a process through without looking, in becoming aware of that, is the awareness open, unfocused, undirected? Or does immediately the thought arise, how can I control these thoughts or get rid of them? It's not useful, it's distracting, it's drifting. Which means it's a new train of thought that has started to take off. The awareness is gone. The new train of thought being fed by habit of judging oneself or others, condemning oneself or others, needing to know how well or how poorly one is doing, needing to be someone who is doing well and dreading to be someone who is not doing well. Can that come into awareness? Not as something to be judged, but as something to be realized that it is going on in the human mind. Not just in my mind. That's this narrow focus. I am so judgmental. I am this, I am that. We all are. There's nothing personal about that. We've been trained this way. And we train others this way. We train each other that way. Because it's all unconscious habit, which as long as it remains unconscious goes on. And the awareness is not there. It cannot survive in this. But if one asks, what makes awareness survive? How can I make it survive? That's a thought with a goal. to have surviving awareness. But awareness is not a goal. It's not something that one can make or control or cause to happen. It happens on its own when one needs to listen, needs to find out about oneself. In all seriousness, not fleetingly, casually. Then anything which comes up, inside or out, in alone or in relationship, is utterly worthy of seeing. There's nothing that is not worthy of being seen. As it is, as it comes up, evolves, and maybe withers away. If the I is at the focal point, the me, the self, then there is no whole awareness. There's already a motive. I want to see certain things and I want to get something out of this seeing. It better have results for me, or else what's the use of doing it in the first place? Can one see such feelings? Not have an idea of oneself of being without motive or selflessly interested in all this. Throw out all ideas about oneself and start from scratch. Not assume that one is anything. Selfish, unselfish, generous, this or that. And watch. Because one understands the seriousness of this matter. That if there is no realization of how one operates, thinks, acts alone and in relationship from one moment to the next, if this proceeds unconsciously, division, misery, antagonism continues throughout the world. Because it is the result of all of our unconscious self-centered habits, or semi-conscious. With this, another question comes up which, in slightly different formulation, was asked to me 4 times during the last couple weeks or so, also within this retreat. So let us talk about it together. And it has to do with, on the one hand, being here in this peaceful, beautiful, quiet environment, where it is at times possible to shed problems, maybe even to forget about oneself and get on with what needs to be done. And the state of the world, which is a state of chaos, disorder, confusion, war, terrorism, endless suffering, endless sorrow, constantly perpetuated, constantly renewed. And this question, what is the relationship between here and there? Or what is my relationship? Being here, at times feeling unencumbered, serene, certain stability, quietness inside. What's my relationship to that? Utter agony raging throughout the world. Human beings being kidnapped, terrorized, bombed, maimed, poisoned, starved. And also the question, shouldn't I do something about that? What's my responsibility? Almost feel guilty being here. I should be there doing something, at least for the children who certainly haven't brought this about, or the innocent victims of all of that. I think one has to ask several questions in this connection. One of them is, why does one separate this place from the world? And is it indeed separate just because bombs aren't falling? Guns aren't going off. They're going off every once in a while. One can hear them. And one does not know what will happen in a simple, clean, whitewashed farmhouse. In a small family at loggerheads with each other. Why does one separate this place from the world? Why does one separate oneself from what is going on in the world? And does one indeed do that? One has to look at that. If one is doing it, that one is doing it, and why is one doing it? Is there any justification for it? Any reason for it? Because how one looks at quote unquote the world determines everything else. How one relates to it and to oneself. How one looks at it. Does one look at the world from a separate feeling, a separate point of view, a separate vantage point? then there is already a division, already a gulf that needs to be bridged. And the feeling comes up, I must do something for it, about it, against it. But who is oneself? Who is oneself who is looking at what is going on in the world? Is one separate from it? Does one feel that separation? Or as one is looking inside, within, and out? Is there a spark of realization that oneself is no different from what is going on in the world? That all the ongoings of past history, culturally, economically, politically, religiously, educationally, has produced us. We're the product of that. We're not separate from it. In history, I remember studying history in Germany, and I found out it's no different whether you studied in Germany or in America or in Russia. History is pretty much the history of wars. Who reigned when and combated, defeated, or was defeated by whom? At what time? You have to remember that by heart. So absurd, but that's how we've been conditioned. You travel through this country from east to west, and there are these historical markers which are announced a mile away, and you stop at them, and 99% of them are about wars. A battle that took place here. Against the French or the English or the Americans or the Indians. And in little villages, the common green, which is there for recreation, very often has a cannon sitting on it. Just taking one aspect at what has conditioned us. Who has created this world? It's created us, and we are, if we persist in our unconscious, automatic, conditioned, programmed ways, keep recreating it, here or there, it doesn't matter. Today war flares up here, tomorrow it flares up there. Yesterday it was at a different place. But it's our common human history to feel separate from each other and in antagonism because of all of our divisions. Inside and out, all of our different fragments, our religions, our parties, our nationalities, you name it, our ideologies. And the identification with that. Has one completely dropped all that? Is one free from the vision, free from this core of selfishness which drives our actions? If there is a moment of freedom. One does not see the world separate from oneself. One realizes that we're all chafing under a common heritage, which is very deeply programmed in the brain, in the human brain, not in mine and yours, or particularly in the Russians. Or the Middle Easterners or the Muslims. Everyone, I think everyone who is identified with a religion or a group is convinced that theirs is the best. Theirs is the one that should survive at any cost. And from that comes naturally collision, because if everybody thinks that way, how can we live together peacefully? We can create organizations of brotherhood, United Nations, but these are just facades for preserving our, what we call of our individuality, which is our divisiveness. I don't believe any organization could ever bring different factions together. How could it? Could only be if factions were dropped, if there were no factions. No adherence to my organization, my this, my that versus yours. If that's dropped, then we may find a common ground. But can one convince someone else to drop it? Has one dropped it oneself? Is one oneself nothing, nobody? And therefore with a real love in the heart. So coming back to this question, what is my responsibility vis-a-vis the world? There's no vis-a-vis there, there's no verses. One is all of that. It's not separate. Is that clear? Does one see that? And if not, does that burn in the mind to find out whether this is so or not? Which means observation during the day in what one sees, reads, hears, how one talks with each other and the news. You turn a newscast on and you see crying women and children having lost their loved ones or their home. What difference does it make where it is? It's the same all over. The agony, the sorrow of loss. Happens in a country of great affluence. Or neglected children. Neglected children are not unique to war-torn zones. They're to be found everywhere, in the most affluent home. neglected because of self-interest. One has to fulfill one's own needs. So many mothers have told me this. I have my own needs to fulfill too. First one wanted the child to fulfill oneself. And that didn't quite work. Then one has to look for fulfillment someplace else. Does one ask this question, what can I do for the world, because one needs to fulfill oneself? This needs to be asked and looked at very, very carefully and profoundly, not to be brushed away out of sight. Is it that one wants to do something for others to fulfill oneself? To fulfill oneself, even if it means to sacrifice. Sacrifice can also be fulfillment. But it has its other side, the resentment at not being fulfilled, not getting the right appreciation, the right gratitude, or not seeing any results. Then this whole thing collapses. Does one want to help others? Because one cannot bear to see the suffering. It's one's own pain that one wants to alleviate too. One has to look at that. Unearth it. Bring it out to light. Yes. I would feel so much happier if I didn't have to know about other people's suffering. Maybe if I can do something, then I won't feel that pain. Why doesn't one want to feel that pain if it is there? Pain of sorrow, which is not just the pain of one's own sorrow, but the pain of sorrow that has swept over humanity since, I don't know since when. Why not feel it without immediately rushing in to do something about it? Feel it profoundly, not just the personal. The personal comes first. And usually we get stuck in that. My personal grievances, my personal injustices that are done to me, have been done to me. It's only when one can look at what is happening within oneself and in the world without this feeling of separation, of being a separate entity that needs to do something about this. Just seeing it all first, understanding it profoundly. That there may awaken this strange thing called compassion. Which is not a personal feeling. And if that compassion is alive, it operates in relationship. Doesn't matter where that relationship takes place. and not being personal, it is not a part. It's not partial. Partial thinking is if I do something here, that won't affect people over there. But if with the same thinking one does something over there, then one will think, well, it doesn't affect people in the west or in the north or south. How is one going to cover it all? How is one going to be everywhere? Is that again a separate feeling of me versus this immensely confused and suffering world out there? A couple of people mentioned in bringing this up, I don't know whether there is guilt there too that makes me want to do something for others, feeling guilty about how well off I am with my family or where I live. Again, guilt is a symptom of feeling separate. What is guilt? I feel guilty that I have it so good and others don't. Is there a fear in that guilt? Of being exposed for what I have, or being made feel guilty by others? There's comparison there. Maybe there's envy in oneself and one is afraid of others' envy. Or this constantly accompanying self-image, I should be as poor as others. I shouldn't have something. So there's the conflict. One really also wants to have something, but also doesn't want to have something. Conflicting ideas about how one should live and the battle between them. Not wanting to give up what one has, but also not wanting to hang on to what one has. Expose it all when you sit or walk, and this is a real gnawing problem. It's a combination of thinking and looking and observing and probing and questioning and allowing whatever is there to come up. Not concerned whether it's undesirable or ugly. Because one is this whole world. One is not separate from it. And unless there's clarity, things brought into the fresh air and light and seen, and with that a pattern interrupted, unless that takes place, the same patterns will perpetuate themselves ad infinitum. Patterns of antagonism, envy, the whole thing. Mutual domination, power. And yet in doing all this questioning and unearthing, there is the sunshine and the wind that's a fact. The utter beauty of the trees, the water spilling over the rocks, the sound of it. That's there too. We will end here for today.